summary of what the idea behind the Dialect Dinners is and how this evening is going to work before I introduce our guest speaker. So Dialect Dinners has really come out of sort of three main things. The first one is that Julia and I have done lots and lots of work, community work, lots of event work over the years. And we have also been lucky enough to be involved in some of the many community events here where we're based in Stroud in Gloucestershire. And we know also from our interest in history that wherever people gather, wherever they come together to share ideas or to move things forward and make change, something magical happens when you share food together, when you break bread together. There is something about being able to share a meal that lifts that experience and takes it on to the next level and gives people some shared ground to sit together and eat together is really important. And the second point was that Julia and I both know that it can be sometimes, especially if you live in a rural place, really hard to get to author events or literary dinners of any kind. So we wanted to make something accessible for everybody. And the third point was that I myself especially am very, very nosy about what people like to eat. It is my second favourite topic, second to how do they get their stories written. So we wanted to bring all of those things together and offer up a meal for us all to share once a month with an interesting and exciting guest author speaker. Speaking of which, I'm going to introduce to you our guest speaker now. That is Nick Hunt. He is an acclaimed travel writer, author, and the editor of the Dark Mountain Project, which many of you may be familiar with. Nick is the author of three travel books about walking in different parts of Europe. Those are Outlandish, Where the Wild Winds Are, and Walking the Woods and the Water, as well as a work of gonzo ornithology. This is a great book, my favourite, The Parakeeting of London, exploring the facts and urban legends surrounding London's newest, brightest incomers. Nick's short fiction collection, Lost Soup and Other Stories, is a journey through the Anthropocene, climate chaos, and the sixth extinction to whatever strange worlds might lie beyond. And Red Smoking Mirror is Nick's debut novel, offering an alternate history set in a Moorish version of 16th century Mexico. His articles have been widely published, and his books have twice been finalists for the Stanford Dolman Travel Book of the Year. Nick's novel was shortlisted for the Viking Award for Fiction with a Sense of Place, and his work included in the Best British Travel Writing of the 21st Century. Nick is a contributor to BBC Radio 4's From Our Own Correspondent and a recipient of the Royal Geographical Society Journey of a Lifetime Award, producing a BBC Radio 4 programme about South Asian migrant workers in the UAE. As well as writing, Nick is an editor. We are thrilled to say he's also a dialect mentor. He's a tutor and a storyteller. And as I'm sure we will cover again, he is the co-director and editor of the Dark Mountain Project, which has been described as a new cultural movement for an age of global disruption. And that has absolutely whetted my appetite. So Nick is going to bring us three courses this evening. He's going to introduce each of those and share them with us. And at the end of each course and discussion of his writing life, we're going to have a quick break for 3 sets of Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand straight over to Nick. Nick, what have you got for us for our first course?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the table. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm going to start, this has only just come to me, but I'm going to start with telling you what I'm not going to serve you, because I'm using this as a way of talking about my journey into writing as well. And just as you were reading that out, it struck me that it was a story about a bowl of soup that actually started me writing in the first place and started my involvement with the Dark Mountain Project, which I'm now an editor of and co-director of. And that was something you mentioned, a short story called Lost Soup that was a sort of similar setup to this. People get invited to a mystery location and sit down around a long table and are served soup that contains the shades of extinct things, animals, species, cultures, languages, ways of life, kind of all swimming around in this horrible, viscous slop, and everybody eats it, and it tastes of nothing. So the kind of story leads towards the eating of the soup. And it was a really weird short story that I didn't know what to do with. And I sent it to this new magazine that was starting up at the time. This was about 2010, that turned out to be what became Dark Mountain, which I've been involved with ever since. And they were really the first people to take me seriously, I guess, and to be excited by a piece of work that I was trying to share that I didn't really think had a home anywhere. So anyone that's kind of starting out writing, it's really worth. Sometimes these kind of things that come, you dream up in the middle of the night and don't know what to do with, might be your route into the next thing, because it certainly was for me. But I'm not going to serve you that, because it's that soup was disgusting and nauseating and tastes of sand and dead things. The thing I'm going to serve you for the first course, and I'll tell you the story behind this, is a single potato. This is the starter, right? It's quite a conceptual starter. A single potato, and it's just been cooked on a hot plate. And I don't think it has anything on it. But when I was invited to do this, I was trying to think of food that I'd had that I really remembered. And this potato was one of the most delicious things I've ever had in my life. And food's circumstantial, right? It's all kind of about the experience you have and the mood that you're in when you receive it. So I'll tell you the story behind this potato. And it's also kind of how I started writing as well. In my early 20s, I went to Guatemala to learn Spanish because they did very good language schools. Like really, you could stay with a host family. The tuition was excellent. So I spent what was meant to be a month, and it turned into 3 months at this language school in a city in Guatemala. And after that, I went traveling up towards Mexico. And I found myself in the highlands of Guatemala, and I wanted to get to a village or a town called Todos Santos Cuchimatan, which has an annual festival where people get extremely drunk and then race horses up and down the street. This is a kind of Mayan tradition that's grown up. Apparently, they wanted to prove that they could ride as well as the Spanish, or better. So when the Spanish brought horses, so the way they did this was to get absolutely wasted and then gallop up and down the street to say, like, we can do this even when we're drunk. And it's a tradition that still goes on. So I was trying to get to this place, and I found that the village I was in, you could walk through the mountains for 3 days with a guide and a horse, and they take people near enough to Todos Santos Cuchimatan. So I found myself walking with a child. He was 14, I think, a Mayan kid called Juan. It was his first time doing this journey. He had been taught it by his father. It was his dad's business. And there was a horse called Chapolin, grasshopper, or a mule, coming along beside us. And it was a walk through the mountains and the highlands of quite a remote part of Guatemala. And Juan was astonishing. He was intensely curious about everything. He had this amazing kind of insatiable appetite to find out how things worked, how things fitted together. And strangely, our level of Spanish was about the same, because it was his second language after his Mayan, whichever language he spoke. I can't remember which one it was, but an indigenous language. I'd been learning Spanish. I was all right, but I wasn't fluent, so we could kind of talk on the same level. Guatemala is so intensely mountainous that it's a linguistic kind of hotspot. There's hundreds of languages spoken, and a lot of them are unintelligible to each other. So on the first day of walking, Juan could speak fluently with everyone around us. On the second day, he was a little bit uncertain. The languages were getting a bit stranger. On the third day, he couldn't understand anything that people were saying in the villages we went through. amazing that just in such a short space of time, he was passing from one country to another, really. And we were followed on the first day by a dog, right? And it wasn't one of the kind of mangy yellow street dogs that I'd seen everywhere else. It was a big black Doberman, something like that, like a large muscular dog. I don't know where it came from, but it decided it wanted to come with us. And Juan would throw it scraps of food, like tortillas and cheese, whatever we were eating. So it followed us along, slept beside us at night. In the morning, you know, it might go off somewhere, maybe hunting, and it would come back and join us. So we kind of formed this strange little traveling band of me, this boy, a horse, and this mysterious dog. And then as we came down into a village on the third day, the dog had disappeared, and I thought maybe it had finally decided to leave. But as we came down into the village, I heard people screaming and shouting, and looked round, and this dog was trotting along beside us with a dead lamb in its jaws, just sort of covered in blood. And there was no point trying to say this isn't actually our dog, because it was clearly kind of part of our party. And a crowd gathered around us. People were really angry. And the whole situation, I mean, I got scared when I saw that Juan, who was very intelligent and kind of streetwise and chatty, he'd gone completely silent. He was just looking at his feet, and he was obviously kind of out of his depth. He didn't understand the language they were speaking. And there was in my mind, some Japanese tourists had been literally lynched, not too far away a couple of years before, because they'd been taking photographs of local kids, and there were rumors that they were they were stealing children. So this was a place, you know, it was not used to outsiders really, and, you know, in very, very unfamiliar territory. And eventually I worked out that I just had to offer to buy the dead lamb, which I did. And instantly it was all smiles and handshakes and kind of everyone relaxed. And then we had this sort of dead lamb on our hands and didn't know what to do with it. And someone said, well, just give it to the dog. So this is like the appetizer to the meal. This is this dog eating an entire lamb in honestly about 10 minutes, bones, wool, everything. It was a impressive and horrific sight. The entire lamb, head to toe, consumed, while these kind of villagers just kind of stood around admiring and sort of giving approving comments on the dog's appetite. Anyway, so that was the third day. It was very stressful, right? And we came down into this flat valley, and this was a place that Juan knew. We had lunch with a friend of his father's who was a farmer, a potato farmer. And after this, you know, quite emotional and quite hard journey that we'd done, we sat in this smoky room in this guy's farmhouse, and he took some potatoes that he'd grown himself. And as I remember it, he put them on a hot plate, right? He didn't chop them up. There was no oil. I don't think there was even any salt, or maybe there was salt, but there wasn't anything else, any seasoning, anything fancy. He just kind of cooked these whole potatoes on a hot plate and served them. And maybe it was the circumstances we were in, or the fact that I was about to say goodbye to this kid who I'd grown to really like. You know, the end of a journey, the start of something else, a moment of respite after this quite stressful situation with the dog and the angry people and the dead lamb. And maybe it was also, you know, potatoes come from the Americas and they have varieties that we don't have. You know, we have a very kind of bland interpretation of what a potato is. We eat the same stuff again and again and again. So I've got no idea what this was or what its kind of properties were, but it was one of the single most delicious things I've ever eaten in my life, was this plain potato. And, you know, I offer it to all of you as a starter, maybe a reminder that food doesn't have to be complicated or expensive, and just a good potato grown in someone's field, plucked out by their hands and put on a hot plate, can be one of the best things you've ever eaten. And I'm also bringing you this at the start of this conversation just because this was the kind of first time I was trying to write, I think, or thinking seriously of myself as a writer. Honestly, writing very bad kind of attempts to be Jack Kerouac or Ken Casey, you know, sort of traveling around this wanderer. I was doing all of that, but that was an important part of learning, was learning how to do things badly. But that experience of travel and being in Guatemala and Mexico and being intensely influenced by everything I saw and learning a new language, you know, it was an incredibly liberating time in my life. So that's another reason to bring it up as a first course.
Amazing. Nick, I always do this. I get really involved in what people are saying and I forget that I'm hosting. It's like I was absolutely absorbed in what you were saying there in that story. You put me right in it. That was an amazing first course. I had no idea what to expect and it exceeded all of my expectations. Thank you so much for sharing. The starter, I'm gonna before I wade in with all my questions, I'm gonna see is anybody else at this point. I'm gonna throw it open to everybody for the Q&A. Please do, you've got a little hand up button that you can use. If you're not sure, there's 3 little dots at the bottom of the screen, or should be, giving you the option to put up your hand. Or if you're not sure how to work that, just physically put your hand up old school, and we'll come around to you. Or you can ask a question in the chat as well. Anybody? Nobody ever wants to be first. Anybody got a question? I was going to ask straight off the bat how old you were when you went to Guatemala. Like, what stage of your life was this?
So this was about 2 years after I graduated from undergrad, university. So I was about 23, 24.
A really sort of seminal phase in your life. What are those formative sections of travel after university?
Yeah, and that, when you're kind of, you don't know who you are quite, or what life is, which is terrifying, but also exciting and allows you to try different things, be different things.
I was going to ask also, it's kind of a basic question, I suppose, but I'm really interested in how people end up doing something for a career. So did you have an inkling at that point that travel writing was something that you wanted to do? Was it something that you always knew was going to be a part of your life in some way, or did it come as a surprise?
Yeah, I've been like quite sort of consistent, I guess, throughout my life with wanting to write. Ever since I was a kid, I was writing something. And I think, I moved through various derivative stages from like ripping off The Hobbit to ripping off other books along, as you kind of grew older. Studied creative writing at university. Honestly, it was terrible. It was a badly taught course that I think I succeeded in producing the very worst work of my life. Much worse than when I found some old stories and stuff that I'd written, and the stuff I wrote when I was 16 or 17, while it was terrible because I was 16 or 17, it was much less embarrassing than what I was writing when I was 19, 20 at university, because I wasn't trying to be anything. I wasn't self-aware in that way. I wasn't reading the greats of literature and trying to compare myself to them. So yeah, definitely kind of, there was a sort of innocence to doing things earlier that comes across much better now. But then, yeah, I kind of, travel writing was a bit, I'll come to that, I think, maybe in my next course, because it was slightly accidental the way I got into writing about travel. But I guess being in Guatemala and Mexico was the first time I did it, because that was the material that I was drawing from.
Amazing. So, and I've had a question.
Yeah, sorry, Juliet.
No, I was just going to say there's a couple of questions on the chat. But first from Holly, what an amazing story, stonkingly told. A fresh grown potato still scented with the soil it has emerged from takes some beating. I agree. And Holly asks, and so does Madeline, did you publish or use your writings from that journey, or have you ever used that incident in fiction? And Charlie, in characteristic style, has asked, what happened to the dog? That's what we all need to know.
Yeah, quite honestly, I can't remember. I think the dog left us at some point after that village, but I can't remember how or why or where it went. I have no idea. It seemed very able to look after itself, from what I can tell.
It feels like it might have sprung
So
from
I
the earth,
imagine the dog.
like the potato. It might have sprung from the earth, that dog. It feels like a sort of slightly not real animal.
Yeah, there was no other dog like it that I'd seen. You know, it wasn't a kind of street dog, like a stray dog. It was something else that was a lot bigger and more powerful. And whether, no, I haven't really, I think both of those were things I wrote that appeared in kind of some magazines ages ago, but no, I've never really used those stories. But those questions are something about fiction. And I will say this because, so my latest book was a novel, which was a bit of a departure from the travel stuff I'd done before. And as you said at the beginning, it's set in Aztec Mexico in the 16th century. But is kind of like, I don't think of it as being that different from a travel book, because all of that stuff that I experienced then in my 20s, that's what ended up becoming this novel, like almost 20 years later, I guess. Well, not quite, 35 years later. So yeah, I mean, everything's compost, right? You never know how it's going to rot down and what you're going to draw from it much, much later. So I kind of did write about Mexico in particular, but it just came out in a very strange way through an alternative reality set in, you know, the 16th century, rather than being a non-fiction piece, you know, as I might have thought I was writing at the time.
Thing. Somebody, Holly, has come in and said it sounds like the mountain version of the black dog of the fens that ate the
Yeah,
lamb. Such
black,
spectacular.
is that Black Shuck? Black Shuck.
Absolutely. And I had another quick question of my own, which was how you, when you entered the world of travel writing, what was the first thing that you wrote that you thought that this is me getting paid for travel writing? Like, how did you first dip your toe into formally writing about your travels?
So that, I mean, it was the first paid travel writing I did, was going to, and I can't remember how I possibly pitched this because I had no idea what I was doing, but I managed to get a commission from The Guardian. I don't think they do this now, to go to the Himalayas, to go on follow a Hindu pilgrimage into Indian Kashmir, to see this melting stalagmite of ice that's a phallus. It's the Shiva lingam, the phallus of Shiva, and it grows in a mountain cave and then it shrinks. And Hindu, you know, it's a very important Hindu pilgrimage. And obviously the story was that there's climate change, the temperature was too warm, and the lingam had not formed, or had kind of only grown by half. And it was a good lesson as well, because I went thinking, imagining I knew what the story was about, and what I thought it was about was Hindu, you know, pilgrims and sadhus kind of tearing their hair out at the non-appearance of their god. You know, their god as it had not come, and climate change kind of impacting on religious belief. You know, like a kind of church melting or something. It's this literally a kind of manifestation of God being affected by man-made climate change. And what I actually found was sure enough, the ice phallus was not there, but tens of thousands of devotees had trekked up the Himalayas on this quite grueling, another 3-day kind of pilgrimage. Actually, it was another 3-day journey, quite hard conditions, you know, cold and kind of wet, up to this cave on the side of a glacier. And in this, like, they weren't tearing their hair out. They were saying, oh, it's God. God does what he wants. You know, we don't know why God hasn't appeared. This is kind of, it's sort of beyond human influence. So it was a very, yeah, like an attitude I didn't expect. And they said, you know, God will come back when he wants to. This isn't, you know, for us to understand. And there was a similar attitude, weirdly, with throwing. It was like a rubbish dump. This sacred mountain, they were chucking, you know, plastic bags, bottles all over it into the streams. And I asked a couple of people why, you know, isn't this a holy place? Why are people kind of throwing litter everywhere? And they said, oh, God doesn't mind. You know, the gods don't mind about litter. You know, they're kind of far too important and cosmological. This is nothing to them. Why would they care? Which again, just kind of completely spun my head around and showed me that you can't. That's a reason to travel, right? Is because you kind of think you know how people are going to react to things until you go somewhere and meet them. You've got no idea.
That's an amazing point. Yeah, to keep your mind open without preconceptions when you, well, that's what travel helps you to do.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. Were there any more questions before we roll on onto the main course? I think that might be it for our starters, which is perfect timing. So without further ado, Nick, I'm going to ask you to bring out our main course. I hope everybody's got their drinks topped up because here comes the mains. Over to you, Nick.
So often I've realized that all of my kind of food choices are very sort of, it's like peasant cuisines, because the way I got into writing books was by going on a long walk from Holland to Istanbul over 8 months. I was actually a vegetarian when I started, and I'd been vegetarian for like 14 years. And that, I mean, I was couch surfing, I was staying in people's houses. It was winter, I was in Germany, and very quickly I started eating whatever fat they threw at me because it was cold and, you know, I was hungry. And it's hard to be, you know, you can't demand vegetarian food necessarily if you're kind of just pitching up on people's doorsteps. And it's quite a meaty culture. Anyway, I started eating meat quite quickly. And I also started eating a lot of stodge. You know, after a long day's walking, you want kind of like comforting, stodgy food. So that's what I'm going to serve tonight. And it's a bit of a kind of pick and mix. There's a few different dishes on the table for this main course. But again, each of them, I thought kind of what food has sort of been important to me. And I'll present a few of the dishes. So the first one, I guess the main for this middle part of the meal is something I've had only in the Baltic. So in Estonia and Lithuania, not countries I was walking through on this big walk, but I've been to both those countries for some reason, always in the depths of winter. So the last time I was in Lithuania on a place called the Curonian Spit, which I'm writing about for my next book, actually. It's a place, a spit of land that goes into Kaliningrad, which is the Russian, you know, the Russian bit of the Baltic. So that's all kind of no-go now. But the reason I was interested in this place is it's where the sands move. It's got these giant sand dunes that kind of roll and have swallowed entire villages. So literally under these kind of mountains of sand are the ruins of fishing villages that didn't move in time. And this happened over the course of several hundred years, mainly because they cut all the trees down. In the 17th century, I think, there was a big tree felling operation. You know, they wanted ships for timber for ships. The Prussians on one side, the Russians on the other, and they were just kind of stripping the place bare. And then the sand, to everyone's surprise, started moving as soon as this happened. And so it became this kind of weird shifting desert where villages literally, you can see on the map, kind of moved 3 or 4 times, some of them, like running from these mountains of sand. It's a really wonderful place, and I'd encourage anyone to to go there. It's deeply strange. You've got the Baltic Sea on one side, a lagoon on the other, and now the trees have grown back, so it's forested. There's elk, there's boar. It's a very rich kind of natural environment built on sand. And in the middle of winter, you don't get many green things as far as I can work out in Lithuania. Maybe I've always just been at the wrong time of year, but the only green vegetable I saw was a gherkin in the time I was there. But what I did see, and I'm serving to you now, is, imagine this. It's wild mushroom soup, or a kind of stew, like a very thick soup made of wild mushrooms, which I love. And that's something I love about much of, the Baltic, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe. They're big mushroom fanatics. They're really into their mushrooms. I love mushrooms. So it's a kind of mushroom soup, but the catch is it's baked inside a loaf of bread. So you get served a kind of steaming loaf of rye bread with this kind of pie-shaped lid, but it's one loaf. It's a single loaf of bread. And then you're given a serrated knife, and you have to saw a hole in the top and then use the bread to dip into the mushroom stew inside. It's absolutely delicious, especially, when it's cold, it's snowing, it's dark, and just to have this like hearty bread mushroom stew. Amazing. And I've always kind of been curious at how they do it. Like how you fit a soup inside a loaf of bread and then it all turns out kind of perfect and crusty. Rye bread's quite dense. I think that's the key. It's a bit like a kind of bowl. So that's the main. And all of these main courses are quite they're quite stodgy, I'm afraid, because again, been walking and want something hearty. So alongside this, if you can stomach it, is a wonderful thing called, I think, kapustniak, which is a Polish sauerkraut soup. So it's literally like sauerkraut heated up, but with kind of carrots, potatoes, onions, lumps of sausage floating around in it. So it's tangy, it's salty, very intensely flavored. And this is something I had in Poland, climbing into the Tatra Mountains with a friend of mine. He's a friend that we have a bit of a kind of habit of getting into unwise situations together. So he wanted to kind of walk in the Tatras, but we didn't realize it was going to be snowy. This was in the middle of summer. So ended up kind of climbing into the mountains very unprepared with the wrong footwear, the wrong clothes, and reached a point where you just have to keep going up because you can no longer get down. And it was really quite a frightening, it was getting dark, snow was falling or even rising because it was very windy, so there was kind of snow coming up from below. The path was getting increasingly icy. He just had a pair of shorts and some terribly inappropriate we were the kind of the idiots that everyone complains about, that mountain rescue hate. That was us. But there wasn't really any way around it, and we realized we had to just keep on going because we couldn't get back down this icy path in time. And we were heading to a mountain hut. And I remember seeing this kind of bend of snow ahead and thinking, if this path doesn't level out there, we're going to have to keep on climbing. And I don't think we can do that. It looks impossible. And then the relief of seeing two silhouettes of two other walkers kind of far ahead of us on the path, and realizing like it's going to be okay, and we can see their footprints in the snow and we can follow them. And those footprints led us to a mountain cabin that I think they'd all been built by the kind of communist, get outside kind of built in the 60s, very like strong, impressive looking buildings up in the mountains. And we opened the door and there was just this kind of wave of hot air and steam and alcohol and cigarette smoke and sweat, this amazing kind of human smell after being out in the mountain thinking you might freeze to death, suddenly being back in humanity in all its kind of warmth and loudness and messiness. And they were serving sauerkraut soup. And we sat down, had a bowl of sauerkraut soup, a glass of this strong red beer. And I just remember that as being, again, one of the best meals of my life, because we weren't dead on the mountain. So I'm afraid I've served you kind of a stew and a soup together. And I'm going to round it.
Amazing.
I'm going to round it off, just so there's something on the side, with something called mamaliga, which they serve in Romania. And this is a kind of polenta. They do lots of polenta stuff. Mamaliga is polenta with sour cream. And it's probably got some other bits in it as well, probably bits of pork, knowing them. Romania is one of the countries that I absolutely fell in love with when I walked through there, and got served a lot of mamaliga by a lot of very kind people. I think it's a real kind of comfort food there. It's like, like a baked potato with cheese. It's something you kind of you eat when you want a bit of cheering up. So yeah, that's going to accompany your various stews and soups on the side.
Amazing. Do you think there would be a rule for restaurants where you have to have a near-death experience before you come in, and then you'll really appreciate the food when you go in there? Madeline's commented as well. It's an incredible description of that bread with the mushroom, like the one pot piece of bread, which I would very much like to know how to make, because that sounds like it would solve a lot of my washing up problems. That sounds amazing. That sounds incredible. Right, I'm going to pause before I wade in with my questions for our second mini Q&A. Anybody else? We've got a question here, actually, I think, which might be a hangover from the last section, which came in from Madeline, which was, what travel writing first inspired you?
Sure. So, I mean, the one that really springs to mind, because this is how I started writing, was Patrick Leigh Fermor, who was the traveller that I followed his journey through to Istanbul, and he walked that in 1933, 34. And for some reason, he was just someone that I kind of fell in love with his writing and the idea of what he did more than anything when I was 18. So it was one of those sort of formative books you read. And I always told myself that one day I would walk in his footsteps to see how Europe had changed. And then did the journey finally when I was 30. And I think it was one of the first times, approaching 30th birthday. Now it feels a long time ago, but then it felt extremely significant. But it was the first time I kind of thought seriously that, there are some things that I might never do, these sort of dreams, and not all of them will happen. It was a bit of a shock. And this was one that I decided I'm going to do that one, if nothing else. So Patrick Leigh Fermor was a big influence in the travel writing world.
And a follow-up question for that one. It was his work do you enjoy right now? You read it at the moment.
So I'm kind of like go through real fiction or non-fiction phases, and I'm deep into really enjoying fiction at the moment. And actually, I don't really see them as that different. I've just read a book by and I never know how to pronounce her name. I think it's Annie Proulx, Proulx, who wrote Shipping News and Brokeback Mountain. But I've just finished her first novel, which is called Postcards. And I mean, it's kind of basically travel writing. It's fiction, but it's a portrait of America in the 50s and 60s. Someone who is kind of cursed to wander, doing odd job after odd job. Completely blown away by it. I thought it was beautiful, beautiful book. So that's the the book I read recently that really comes to mind. And before that, William Golding, The Inheritors, which was the book he wrote right after Lord of the Flies. It's really weird. It's written from the perspective of a group of what you realize are Neanderthals encountering the first humans, the first Homo sapiens. It's really good, really good. So I'm loving fiction at the moment.
Brilliant. I'm writing those down. We're going to have to pick your brains for all of these suggestions and the meals after this, so we can send them out after as well. I've had a great question in from Louise, which says, how conscious are you at the time of the situations that will become retold in your writing? Does that sharpen your attention and bring you close to the experiences, or does it? And I'll scroll down, or more removed as you're observing?
That's a really good question. Wow, that's really interesting, because I guess it kind of does both. I know that there's a kind of intense, heightened level of interest that happens when I know I'm somewhere to write about it. So I write constantly in a notebook and can't stop, and everything seems fascinating and of potential interest. So in that sense, it brings me a lot closer. But by the very act of writing, you are removed, because you're the person who's maybe not participating or just being normal, but you're kind of constantly taking notes. So both at the same time, I think. So it's quite a slightly kind of a bit of a paradox, I suppose, that you are, by being more involved in something, you remove yourself from it. But the hope is, I suppose, that you're finding something kind of deeper. I've kind of thought of, I know that there's a phrase that I got from T.H. White, who wrote The Once and Future King, which is amazing, the Arthurian legend, but also wrote the Goshawk, very strange, dark nature book where he trains a goshawk and has lots of kind of sort of S&M repressed stuff going on. He was quite a difficult man, I think. But there's a phrase, he uses lots of kind of medieval falconry terms, and there's a phrase in Yerek, which, as I understand it, is when a bird of prey is kind of on the hunt, and with this kind of almost terrifying focus, the eyes of an eagle kind of staring something down. And that's what I've come to term the state of being interested in the world, where I kind of feel like I'm on and everything's going in, everything's fascinating, everything's of interest. And then it's quite clear when I'm not in that state, because I just don't notice things. And that's why I like traveling. I think it is possible to be in that state all the time, I guess, but it's exhausting. And being in another place kind of helps you focus and look for experience, look for material.
Oh, amazing. And you've also answered the next question from Hannah, which was, how do you document? Do you take notes as you travel? You mentioned that you do take notes as you travel. Is there anything more that you do to make sure that you've caught things in the moment rather than needing to return to them in memory? Or is that awkward? I'll just whip out my notebook and start writing things down.
Yeah, it is a bit awkward, but I haven't found any other way to do it. I don't really record, partly because I hate transcribing things. I find it utterly unbearable transcribing anything. So I try and avoid it. I mean, if I'm having a conversation, say in an interview, I'll record someone, but I don't love doing that, because I know everything is kind of, writing in a notebook is also quite odd, but I find it kind of more natural than sticking a recorder in someone's face and kind of nodding along. Often it changes the way that people respond, I think. So what I normally do, if I'm kind of with people and they're saying interesting things, I'll just say, do you mind if I take notes? And normally they don't. and then I try and scroll as much as I can. Yeah, so that's, I mean, I can't do it from memory, especially if it's something like a day's walking, because I'd forget 99% of it. And it's those kind of small things that come to you that might turn out to be really important. And I'm sure many people have had the experience of going like, oh God, what was that woman wearing, or what kind of tree was that person was talking about, or why was it? There's these things that you cannot remember, but when you're coming to write about something and you're making a pattern out of the information you've gathered, one of those things might be absolutely key, or it might link to 2 or 3 other things and give you a kind of part of the narrative. So I just try and write down as much as I can, and most of it will be useless, but some of it might help.
Finding those golden nuggets through all the you've got. Oh, so interesting. But I've got some more questions, but I'm going to save them for the end because it's imperative that we don't miss pudding. Or I'm going to be posh and say dessert as well. So it's my difficult job to keep us to time because I've got loads more questions. So Nick, I'm going to make sure that we squeeze in our final course. We may run just a little bit over after 8 o'clock because I know there's some really interesting questions, but not too much. So I'll hand back to you for the sweet section. What have we got, Nick?
Well, it's really simple, but it's, I think, one of the most delicious things, and it's just Greek yogurt and honey. There's 2 reasons I've chosen this. I think one because I encountered the origin of yogurt at the end of this walk to Istanbul, walking through a village in Bulgaria in the rain, and quite honestly being a bit sick of walking by that point, and just kind of wanting to speed things up a bit. But I noticed that there were an unusual number of kind of babushkas, sort of old ladies in shawls and headscarves under little umbrellas selling pots of yogurt along the road. And I'd seen that before in Bulgaria, but never in that amount. And I bought one of these pots, even though it was quite cold and raining, and then was sleeping in a tent later that night. And it was just amazing, amazing yogurt, like kind of rich and creamy and tastes like good bacteria kind of flowing throughout your system. And then later found out that this village claims to be the place where yogurt comes from. And it sounds like a kind of one of those, weird sort of myths. But Bulgaria, they think, is where the Bacillus, I can't remember what it's called, it's like Bacillus bulgaricum or something. It's where the bacteria was grown first, or whatever, however you get that bacteria, where did it come from? I'm not sure. But yeah, Bulgaria claims to be the country where yogurt was from, and that village I walked through seems to be the origin of yogurt. So that's definitely getting served. Have to go to that village and buy a few jars of this yogurt and serve it with good wild, forest honey. And just another reason why I wanted to serve that is, so quite early after I started dating the woman who I later married, Caroline, she announced she was going to mind a bookshop on the island of Santorini in Greece. And I was doing some horrible job in London, sort of servicing the properties of extremely rich people who were never there, and was looking for any excuse. So I managed to convince her that I should come as well. And we ended up looking after this bookshop called Atlantis Books, which is on Santorini. And we ate a lot of Greek yogurt and a lot of honey. And it just seems to kind of, reminds me of that time. And it was fun being a bookseller. It got kind of, Santorini's weird. It was beautiful at the start. We got there before the season had started, and it was kind of deserted and like astonishingly, strangely beautiful place. It's the caldera of an extinct volcano, and yeah, it's just extraordinary. And then the cruise ship started rolling in, and every day another restaurant or bar would open kind of above us or next to us or underneath us, because all the houses are sort of stacked on top of each other. So it got kind of worse and worse, and we had to leave in the end. But there was a couple of months of eating yogurt and kind of enjoying these deserted streets and these rocky, cliffy beaches.
Right, I'm glad you told me that Santorini got crowded, because I was trying to keep a lid on my jealousy there, Nick, about being a bookseller on a Greek island, because that sounds pretty sweet. Like the yogurt and the honey. Thank you for that amazing pudding. I'm going to roll straight into other people's questions now, because I've got a little stack of them waiting. Do you just put your hand up if you want to say a question as well? You don't have to leave it in the chat. But Dave has asked, I'm just wondering about the solitude of traveling in the way that you do. There's no one to contradict or reinforce thoughts or choices or decisions, but also no one to validate except yourself. Does that resonate, or have you found a way around it, or it's not true at all?
Yeah, no, I think that is true. I find that partly because I'm sort of taking notes all the time, it's quite hard having a traveling companion, because I wouldn't be very social, or kind of, also I think honestly I'd probably feel like I would stop taking notes out of respect to the other person who doesn't want to stop every 5 minutes and kind of wait for me to scribble in a book. So I'd sort of self-censor, and I think I'd lose a lot of stuff there. But yeah, there is something a bit sad sometimes about not sharing something with someone and not having that experience kind of, sort of validated or shared, because you want to share things with people that you love. But I guess it kind of goes into writing more that way, because that's who you share it with. You're sharing it with a piece of paper, and then ideally a readership at some point on the other side of that.
Yeah, I guess those thoughts are your thoughts, and they're sort of drip through of somebody else's opinions on things as you go as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's funny that, people can, it's good and bad, isn't it? Because people can utterly ruin experiences. They can also give you the experiences. They can see things that you wouldn't see, or they could have I'm not always very sociable, actually, and a lot of my writing kind of does depend on talking to people. But there are often days when I feel like I just don't want to be noticed and want to kind of slip between the cracks a bit. But I've been in that state, and there's trying to write about something, and it's been a friend who's actually gone up to someone and had a conversation and learned stuff that I wouldn't have learnt myself. I guess just choose your companions wisely.
Oh, rules for life, definitely, in travel and in all things. I've got a question from Madeline, which is, do you ever have self-doubt about writing a project? A sort of moment of, what on earth am I doing here? Who am I to write about these countries and people? Do you ever wonder about the colonial gaze?
Yeah, I do. I mean, as soon as a publisher or anyone kind of likes an idea, I find myself doubting it. I'm in the middle of that now, because I'm starting another travel book, and I'm thinking, yeah, who am I? Why am I doing this? It's a dip that you have to go through. I think the colonial gaze, I think it's slightly different from just general self-doubt, or thinking, what do I have? Why should I write about anything? Why would anyone be interested? I think that's one thing. And then there's the kind of legacy of colonialism and how it intersects with travel writing, and being white in certain places. The feeling that you can just turn up and write about people. I mean, that's something that I've definitely, I hope, learned from. And I think in my first book, there are descriptions, not of cultures, but of individuals, that I now regret, because I think it just wasn't very generous to describe people in a certain way. And so I've kind of, I think, learned how to do that a bit better, or think more about how to bring someone, represent someone in print, because it's a big you know, it's a big kind of liberty that you're taking.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And I know Juliet's got a follow-up question. Juliet, do you want to ask it directly rather than me reading it out?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nick's kind of covered it really. It's just whether or not you're kind of conscious of yourself as, you know, not just as a kind of having that kind of colonial gaze and being a white man, but, you know, being a man and kind of having those kind of the freedom to move and the resources. I walk alone a lot, and it's definitely a big source of inspiration for my writing, but I do it with a large dog. And I've been thinking recently how I probably wouldn't do it as much as I do if I didn't have my dog with me. It kind of gives me a sort of sense of protection, rightly or wrongly. He's very soft, so he probably wouldn't hurt anybody. But you know, I kind of as a female moving through that space, I'm kind of more conscious about it. So yeah, so I was just you've kind of answered it already, but I don't know if you've got anything else that you would you want to add.
No, I just, yeah, I know that I have a very particular way of kind of going to places based on who I am and what I look like. And I think it's, to be aware of that is very important, and to be honest about it as much as possible. I recently, so my last travel book, I was in the Polish-Belarus border in 2019, and walked through that primeval forest Białowieża, which is now kind of, you know, militarized fences and border police. And in the last year, I befriended a Syrian guy living in Bristol, asylum seeker. And after a couple of weeks of talking to him, I realized that that was how he crossed into Europe. He crossed through that very same forest over, I mean, several weeks of just kind of being in the forest, cutting his way through with wire cutters, being chased by the Polish police, having already been kind of roughed up by the Belarusian police. And it just, yeah, it was just kind of amazing talking to him and trying to explain, like, oh, I've been there. You know, I've been to that forest, I've crossed that border. But for me, it was, you know, going into Belarus was slightly scary, but it was also kind of, I was able to sort of enjoy the communist official in the big hat and the epaulets and everyone being very strict and stern. And it all seemed a little, you know, it all seemed a bit silly for me. But it wasn't for him. It was, you know, it was life and death. So that, yeah, it's kind of made me reflect on, again, how I might have written that chapter differently if I'd met him before I wrote it, with that awareness in mind that there were going to be people, you know, sleeping in those woods and trying to eat, you know, trying to navigate through this jungle.
Thank you for your reflections on that. And I'm going to come over to Charlie, who's got a hand up to ask a question as well.
Yeah, it's like, I'm sorry to ask a bit of a wanky question, but like, as a writer, what do you perceive as like your purpose? What's your aim or your goal with what you do? You know, what if it was something that was almost like a calling that, you know, it's obviously it's what you do in this life. Like what would your, you know, what would, like when you die, what would you be like? Oh yeah, Nick did this with his writing. Do you know what I mean? What would you love for that to be? You know, what drives that purpose in you?
I mean, just on a really sort of facile level, I enjoy it. It makes me happy. And that's something that's not a bad thing to do with a life. It doesn't always make me happy. Sometimes it makes me absolutely miserable and really bad company. But I get a huge amount of kind of fulfillment and pleasure from it in general. And that's why I do it. So yeah, because I like it is one answer. I've always been a bit wary of people that say the role of a writer is to do this or that, or like a writer's duty is to do this or that, because it's kind of always spoken like it's some kind of objective truth. And as far as I can work out, there's no kind of, you never sign a contract saying what your duty is as someone that likes to record your thoughts by writing them down. You know, you're not signing the Hippocratic Oath, as far as I'm concerned. Some writers might think differently. but within that, I mean, what I'd like to do personally is be useful to other people in what I kind of see and think and share, whether that's talking about, you know, places in the world at a particular moment of time, or looking ahead to the more sort of existential times that we're in with this, you know, the way our planet is now in this very small window of existence that we have. Yeah, I mean, it's quite honestly, it's a bit of a mystery to me. I don't know what you know, if I want to have a legacy. I'm not really thinking like that, but I'd like to kind of be useful in some way by yeah, communicating, sharing stories that people will find interesting, hopefully moving and useful.
I love that. My friend said to me last week that to live a happy life is the best rebellion that we can do in this life. So I think that's a great reason if it makes you happy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if it makes you happy and doesn't damage someone else, which I don't think I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Joy is an act of resistance, I think. So
Yeah,
thanks,
that's
Chan.
nice.
It's a great question. I know we've hit 5 past the hour, but I don't want to curtail this discussion because there's so much interesting stuff in the chat. So I'm just going to go on for a few more minutes if everybody will bear with us. So I just wanted to take some comments from Holly. He says, when I walk alone, it takes hours of wandering and note-taking, and when I walk with someone else, it's quicker and I notice far less. I travelled through Europe for 3 weeks when younger with notebooks and a teddy as companions and was lonely at times but content most of the time. So thanks, Nick, for sharing your stories. It's been spellbinding. Thanks, Holly. Amazing.
Thank you.
And just going to have a quick look through in real time. Oh, Hannah's got a great question. Did you have a place you'd like to visit and walk and write about that you haven't been to yet?
Yeah, many, I think. And again, not all, some of them I will never do.
Tricky question.
What was that?
It's a tricky question just to narrow it down to one place.
Yeah, I don't think I have one place. I don't think I have one place that, apart from maybe I've kind of had several near misses of going to Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia and that bit of the Caucasus that, as always, for some reason, I'm fascinated by it. So that's somewhere I do hope to go one day. And there's amazing walking trails being constructed, interrupted by war, but that is a place I'd be happy if I went to before I died.
Amazing, thank you. And I just had a really quick question, which is that during the lockdowns, none of us did a great deal of traveling. And I think a lot about finding that thing of being on, that hawk eye, that eagle eye, in mundane and domestic places. Did you manage to find your eagle eye that you get from travel during the lockdowns while you're at home? Is there anywhere that brings that out in you that's more domestic than exotic?
I mean, I wrote my kind of fantasy alternate history novel right over lockdown in a very cliched way. A lot of travel writers I know became novelists for that, that period of time. That was very much, like, looking at it now, a kind of an escape, but also a way of asserting some kind of control because you're in charge of a world, right? You can kind of make things happen. So it makes a lot of sense that I was doing that at a time when we had very little control. But in terms of kind of the real world and not the world of the imagination, I don't know, I remember it as very kind of bright, clear, sunny, sharp. Everything seemed weirdly focused, and kind of like the leaves on the trees and everything was kind of strangely beautiful in a way that felt completely discordant with everything else that was going on. And whether that was less pollution or whatever, or just being forced to look at something. But it was, there was a lot of beauty in that time that made it deeply, deeply strange as well.
Amazing. Well, with my eye on the time, thank you for everybody for hanging on extra. We could easily have chatted for a couple of hours, to be honest, and we really squeezed it into an hour. And I've got loads more questions that I haven't had time to come to, but I am just, somebody said they feel very well fed, and that's exactly how I feel, nourished by this discussion. Thank you so much. And talking about your walking, I just want to recommend to everybody on your website, Nick, is your TED Talk on your walk from Holland to Istanbul, which says traveling quickly is a waste of time. And I really recommend everybody go and have a listen to that because it's amazing. I wanted to mention also that issue 25 of Dark Mountain is out now. That's just come out and it looks amazing. I'm waiting for mine to arrive, so I can't wait to read it. And I wanted to also mention that Nick is a mentor with Dialect. So I'm just going to drop that into the discussion as well. And Dialect is open for membership, where we gather once a month like this, and we have 3 writing hours a week together in a WhatsApp chat and all kinds of stuff. I won't go on, but the membership is open if you are interested. And I guess it's up to me to bring to a close the after dinner coffee section, which we've definitely drifted into here. So I hope everybody has had a very filling and nourishing meal with Nick. Thank you so much, Nick, for being our inaugural speaker and bringing those dishes. We will get the menu for everybody. We'll get it sent out to you along with all the other bits and bobs. We hope to have some audio to send to you as well. Thank you to all of our dinner guests for coming along and taking a punt on what is a bit of a mad idea, really. So thank you very much for taking a chance on it and joining us this evening. I'm so grateful to our speaker, Nick Hunt. I'm so grateful to everybody for coming. Thank you very much. And we will see you. Our next one is May 28th, same time. It's a Tuesday night. And our guest speaker will be the travel writer, Adam Weymouth. So we really hope you guys are there as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thanks for your questions too. Lovely to see you all.
Oh, they were great.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.